Did you know that right now half of your brain is fighting, it's struggling with the other half? Neville explains it masterfully in one of the oldest stories of humanity. Because in the Old Testament, a story is told that was written much earlier. That neuroscience would talk to you about mental patterns and brain networks and theta and alpha waves, or about automatic responses of the nervous system. And I'm referring to the first family conflict in history, which was a fight between brothers. Right? I imagine you already know this story of Cain and Abel, which takes place in Genesis. I remember that in school they told us this was the first crime in human history. Because in Genesis there's a young man who kills his brother in the middle of a field. And that's what they tell us, that's the story. But let me tell you that this isn't just a story about a crime that happened between two brothers. It's a story that happens inside of us constantly, and it happens every day. Okay? Now pay close attention, because exoterically, this is what they taught us, right? In the beginning, Adam and Eve leave Eden, they are expelled from Eden, and the first birth in history happens. Alright, Adam and Eve first have Cain, and then, well, Abel is born. Time passes, Cain grows up, and he decides to work the land, he becomes a farmer, and Abel becomes a shepherd. And then, the story goes that suddenly one day the two of them agree and decide to bring an offering to God, and each one has to choose what he is going to bring. So Abel carefully tends to his flock and selects the best from his herd. And so Cain decides to bring the fruits of his labor. Since he is a farmer, he brings some fruits and vegetables. And after that, both of them go to meet with God. Right after, God gladly accepts Abel's offering, but he rejects Cain. He tells him no. What happens? Cain gets angry, he becomes furious, he's filled with jealousy inside, and then what does God do? God still asks him and says, Cain, why are you angry? Why has your expression changed? He says to him. But he also warns him, sin is lurking at your door, and you can control yourself, God says to him. But Cain doesn't listen, and instead he says to Abel, brother, come here, come with me, he says. And then what does he do? He takes him to the field, and then there he decides to separate Abel's vital energy from his body. In other words, he kills him. And then God speaks to Cain and asks him, hey Cain, where is your brother? To which Cain answers very bluntly. He says, am I my brother's keeper? Look, and he's answering that to God. Then God responds to him, but what did you do? Your brother's blood cries out from the ground. You are going to face consequences. Now, no matter how much you work the soil, it will no longer yield fruit for you. And you will be a wanderer and walk the world as a fugitive, as a vagabond. What happens? Cain gets scared and complains to God. He says, but Lord, please, this punishment is too harsh for me. You're taking everything from me, you're driving me away from your presence, and anyone who sees me out there will want to kill me for what I did. God still answers him, and in a strange way, I'll tell you why. Because he says to him, Cain, don't worry, that's not going to happen, it won't be like that. If anyone dares to harm you, the punishment for him will be 7 times worse. Yes? So here I tell you that God does something strange, because what he does is put a mark on Cain. But he doesn't put that mark on him as a punishment, but rather as a form of protection. Why? Because anyone who harms him will receive that harm multiplied by 7. Okay? After that, Cain goes to a place called Nod, near Eden, finds a wife, and then builds a city. And that's it. That's where it ends. That's the story. So now I want you to think about the following. Because this is where it gets interesting when you look at it from the metaphysical interpretation. Because look, you believe that the creator of the entire universe, the infinite intelligence, the God who can do everything, omnipresent and omnipotent. Do you think that God has preferences for any kind of food? Cain brings him fresh fruit and God is going to say, no, actually, I prefer meat. And then God asks Cain, hey, where is your brother? It's God, right? He should know where his brother is, where Abel is. Yeah? Do you think he didn't know what his grandson would be? They're his grandchildren since Adam and Eve are their parents. And then God still protects Cain after he killed his brother, so that later the young man finds a wife and builds a city. So, if you look at it this way, you realize something, and that's that this text isn't trying to tell you a news story from the ancient world. The first quarrel between brothers, the first quarrel of humanity, right? It's not recounting secular history, as Neville would say. It's showing you a psychological drama. It's like a symbolic manual of how human beings work when consciousness descends to live this three-dimensional experience. And this is where Neville comes in forcefully, because Neville tells us something that shakes everyone. When you first read it, and when someone first starts reading about these topics, because Neville tells you that the Lord the Bible talks about is not someone external, but rather your own consciousness. And in Exodus 3:14, how does God define himself? As I am? I am is the Lord's self-definition. So when you read God in this chapter of Genesis, according to Neville, you can read it as my consciousness. And if Cain and Abel are his grandchildren, then they come from that same root. In other words, they are two functions of that same consciousness. They would be two parts, two ways of living within the human being, where Cain represents the limited perception of the senses. The passive surrender to appearances. That's how Neville describes Cain in times of sowing and harvest. Cain is accepting the world as it is, and as what you are being taught. It's like saying, this is what I see, therefore this is what I am. Yes, and believing that is what leaves you trapped with your unfulfilled desire. Yes, because if you only accept what your senses tell you, then your future is conditioned to be a repetition of the present. No. The rejected person would keep feeling rejected. The poor person would keep thinking like a poor person and being poor. The clumsy person would keep feeling clumsy and therefore would keep being clumsy. Abel, on the other hand, represents something else. For Neville, Abel is desire fulfilled. He is that part of you that can rise above the evidence of what your senses show you. It is your ability to internally sustain a reality that's still. Hasn't manifested outwardly yet, and you still can't touch it in the outer world. That's why God, your consciousness, rejects Cain's offering, because Cain offers to consciousness what he harvested with his senses from the earth, what came out of the earth. But Abel offers something very different. Abel offers the firstborn of his flock. He offers the first, he offers the best. And Neville interprets the shepherd as someone who takes care of an inner state, not just something material. And for Neville, Abel offers faith. Neville, in this chapter, connects it with Hebrews, where we are told that without faith it is impossible to please him. And we are also told that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Those are Neville's stock phrases, you know? So with this, you can realize that Cain and Abel are nothing more than two ways of using your consciousness. You can surrender to what you're seeing, or you can actively assume with active faith what you don't see yet. Right? And it's interesting because this isn't just an idea that comes from the Bible, but there are very similar stories throughout history. In Rome, for example, Romulus kills Remus and then founds Rome. In Egyptian mythology, Zed kills Osiris because he's jealous of him and wants to usurp the throne. So this kind of fight between two always shows up. And it can be interpreted that way. The part of you that only trusts what it can touch, what it can measure, what it can verify, versus the part of you that can maintain genuine faith. Faith you cannot see, but faith in action. And if you go to the Psalms, Psalm 46 tells you, what does Psalm 46 say? Be still and know that I am God. You've read it thousands of times. What does it mean to be still? To be still is to cease, to stop, to let go. It is to stop the activity of the rational mind, which is only processing what your senses are shouting at you and what you can see, nothing more, with your physical senses. And then in Matthew 6, it tells you, go into your room and closing the door, pray to your Father who hears you in secret. What is it? What is the room? The room is your inner space. Close the door and close the door. Closing the door means closing your senses. Okay? So these texts, do you agree that they can't just remain theoretical? Because the obvious question is, okay, this is very interesting, this teaching is very old, it makes sense to me and it's very nice, but Rahul, tell me, how do I apply this? What do I do? How can I put it into practice? Well, first you close the door, right? And you do it literally and symbolically, you close that door. What do? You look for a place where no one will interrupt you. And then, second, you stay still. You take this pause, you stop giving power to Cain, to what your senses keep insisting on repeating to you about your current situation. Okay? And then, number 3, once you enter that stillness, you choose a scene. Here I'm going to go in depth with Neville. It's a scene that is small, that is concrete, that is natural. Alright? It's a scene that implies that what you desire has already been fulfilled. For example, do you want to visit somewhere? Tell me, what would you be doing? Who would you be with? What kind of bills would you have in your wallet? If you're in Colombia or in Europe, what currency would you have? Do you want a new job? What would the schedule be? What would you be wearing? How would you feel returning home? Which route and destination would you choose? Do you want a stable relationship? How would that person treat you? Would they make you morning coffee? Would they respect you? Would you go out regularly? Yes. Then you answer those questions. And another thing is that you don't have to make the scene something spectacular, you know? The only thing you have to do is make it feel real. And you hold it not once, not twice, but you repeat it night after night. Until you stop feeling like you're imagining and start feeling like you're remembering something that's already true, okay? That's where Abel comes back to life, comes back to live. Because something curious, Abel, do you know what it means? It means breath of life. And that's why every time you feel your fulfilled desire as real again, Abel breathes again and breathes again inside you, okay? So if you notice what Neville was teaching as a spiritual technique in the 1950s, this story was showing symbolically for thousands of years, okay? And when you see it like that, that story stops being an old tale of jealousy between brothers and becomes an instruction. And it's an instruction for today, it's an instruction for you, not for tomorrow, not for when the world changes, it's for today. Alright? So, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Tell me in the comments what resonated with you the most from this story. You know I'd love to hear it. I enjoy reading your comments and try to reply to most. And if you want to go deeper into these kinds of teachings and especially learn how to apply them in your daily life, well, I invite you to the TM Plus School, where that's exactly what we work on, taking it step by step. And also, at the end of this month, we'll have the second edition of our Metaphysical Retreat, which is a weekend dedicated to not just understanding these ideas, but starting to live them, and as a result, you'll see the transformation. So if you still feel like this is your moment, I'm going to leave the link down below so you can click on it and get more information. Alright, so thank you so much for joining me for this talk on Cain and Abel. I send you a big strong hug, and without further ado, from Master Your Mind with Rahul, I'll see you in the next video program. See you soon.